Welcome to this gentle exploration of one of the universe's most enchanting mysteries, a paradox so beautiful and bewildering that it challenges the very foundations of how we understand reality. Tonight, we drift into the realm where time itself becomes a möbius strip, where endings birth their own beginnings, and where the future reaches back through the cosmic tapestry to write its own past. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a concept that whispers to us about the circular nature of causality, like an eternal song that has always been singing itself into existence. Picture, if you will, a violin whose melody has echoed through concert halls for centuries, passed from musician to musician, each one believing they inherited it from the previous generation. But as we trace its history backward through the flowing river of time, we discover something profoundly unsettling, yet beautifully mysterious. This violin has no maker. It simply exists in an eternal loop, given to the past by the future, which received it from that very same past. There is something almost musical about this paradox, a cosmic symphony where the final note creates the first, and the composition writes itself into being. In the quiet depths of human consciousness, we have always sensed that time might not be the simple, linear progression we experience in our daily lives. Ancient civilizations spoke of cyclical time, of eternal returns, of serpents swallowing their own tails in endless circles. The Ouroboros of Egyptian mythology, the Wheel of Time in Hindu cosmology, the eternal recurrence of the Stoics. All of these speak to a deep, intuitive understanding that perhaps causality is not always a straight arrow flying from past to future. Perhaps, in the grand dance of the cosmos, some things are their own cause and their own effect, existing in loops that have neither beginning nor end. Our minds evolved in a world of falling apples and rolling stones, naturally seek origins and destinations. We are creatures of narrative, always asking what came before and what comes next. This is why the Bootstrap Paradox creates such a delicious tension in our thoughts. It asks us to imagine something that violates our most fundamental assumptions about how reality operates. Yet, as we'll discover in our journey tonight, modern physics suggests that these loops might not just be philosophical curiosities or science fiction plot devices. They might be woven into the very fabric of space-time itself, waiting in the mathematical equations that describe our universe, like sleeping dragons in the depths of possibility. As we begin this contemplative voyage through the paradox that challenges our understanding of cause and effect, let yourself drift into that space between waking and sleeping, where logic becomes fluid and imagination mingles with the scientific truth. For in exploring the Bootstrap Paradox, we are not just examining an abstract concept. We are touching upon questions that go to the heart of what it means to exist in a universe where time might not be what we think it is. There is something profoundly calming about accepting that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but rather to be contemplated, like watching stars wheel across the night sky, knowing that their light has traveled through time to reach us, carrying messages from the past that shape our present, and perhaps, in ways we cannot yet fathom, our future as well. In the gentle realm of theoretical physics, where mathematics dances with imagination, the Bootstrap Paradox emerges as one of the most elegant puzzles ever conceived. Let us drift deeper into understanding what this paradox truly means, approaching it not with the harsh light of rigid logic, but with the soft glow of contemplative wonder. The Bootstrap Paradox, sometimes called a causal loop or an ontological paradox, describes a situation where an object or piece of information exists without ever being created. It simply is, eternal and self-causing, like a river that is its own source and mouth. Imagine, in the quietest corner of your mind, a poet who discovers a beautiful book of sonnets in an old library. Enchanted by their beauty, she memorizes every word, every rhythm, every metaphor. Years pass like leaves on an autumn wind, and this poet invents a time machine. She travels back 200 years, and finding that these poems don't yet exist, she writes them down from memory and publishes them under a pseudonym. These poems then wait in that old library until a young poet, herself in the future, discovers them. The question that haunts us like a gentle ghost is this: who originally wrote the poems? They have no author, no moment of creation, no flash of inspiration. They exist in an endless loop, each iteration exactly the same, forever cycling through time like a cosmic prayer wheel. This is the heart of the Bootstrap Paradox. Objects and information that exist without origin, without a creative spark, without that moment when something emerges from nothing. Our minds, accustomed to the linear flow of causality, struggle like moths against glass when confronted with such concepts. We are beings who understand the world through stories of beginning, middle, and end. A chair was built by a carpenter who learned from a master who was once an apprentice. An idea springs from a mind influenced by other ideas, which themselves have genealogies stretching back through the generations of human thought. Yet here, in the Bootstrap Paradox, we encounter entities that have no such genealogy. They are orphans of causality, existing without parents, without ancestors, without that chain of cause and effect that we use to make sense of everything around us. A watch that was never manufactured, yet ticks away the seconds. An equation that was never derived, yet perfectly describes a fundamental law of nature. A melody that was never composed, yet has always existed, humming through the corridors of time. There is something both disturbing and oddly comforting about contemplating such paradoxes. Disturbing because they challenge our most basic assumptions about how reality functions, that every effect must have a cause, that information cannot spontaneously generate itself, that entropy always increases. Yet comforting too, in a strange way, because they hint at a universe far more mysterious and interconnected than our everyday experience suggests. Perhaps in the grand tapestry of existence, some threads weave themselves, some patterns emerge from their own necessity, some truths simply are, without needing to be born. The Bootstrap Paradox also raises profound questions about the nature of information itself. In our digital age, we've come to understand information as something physical, something that requires energy to create, store, and transmit. Every bit of data, every quantum of knowledge seems to demand a thermodynamic price. Yet here, in these causal loops, information appears to exist free from these constraints, neither created nor destroyed, simply circulating through the closed curves of space-time like an eternal whisper that speaks itself into being. It's as if the universe contains pockets where the normal rules are suspended, where effect can precede cause, where the future can reach back and plant seeds. In the past, that will grow into itself. There is something beautifully appropriate about the fact that the Bootstrap Paradox first crystallized in human consciousness not through the equations of physicists or the theorems of mathematicians, but through the imagination of a storyteller. In 1941, as the world was caught in the turbulent currents of war, Robert Heinlein sat at his typewriter and created a story that would give this temporal puzzle its most enduring name. By his bootstraps emerged like a strange flower in the garden of science fiction, its petals unfolding to reveal a mystery that would captivate minds for generations to come. Heinlein's story follows Bob Wilson, a man working on his thesis about time travel, who suddenly finds himself pulled into his own future, meeting various versions of himself, each trying to manipulate the timeline for their own purposes. The title itself carries a delicious irony. It references the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a physical impossibility that becomes a temporal reality in the story. Like a literary möbius strip, the narrative loops back on itself, with information and objects circulating through time without clear origins. The story doesn't just describe the paradox, it embodies it, its very structure, mirroring the circular causality it explores. But Heinlein was not the first to sense these temporal mysteries lurking at the edges of human imagination. Throughout the history of literature, we find echoes of this paradox, like whispers from a future that was always part of our past. The ancient Greek playwrights understood the power of prophecies that fulfill themselves, of futures that reach back to ensure their own existence. Oedipus, fleeing from a prophecy, runs straight into its arms. The very act of trying to prevent the future becomes the cause of that future, a bootstrap of fate and free will intertwined. Science fiction, that beautiful marriage of scientific speculation and human storytelling, became the perfect greenhouse for these temporal paradoxes to flourish. Writers like H.G. Wells had already opened the door to time travel with The Time Machine in 1895, but it was the golden age of science fiction, that period from the 1940s through the 1950s, that truly began to explore the implications of causal loops. Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and others joined Heinlein in weaving stories where time became not just a setting, but a character itself, full of tricks and paradoxes. What makes this literary genesis so fascinating is how these storytellers, working with nothing but imagination and typewriter keys, anticipated problems that would later occupy the brightest minds in theoretical physics. They were conducting thought experiments in narrative form, exploring the boundaries of causality through character and plot rather than equations and diagrams. In their stories, we find the same questions that would later emerge from the mathematics of general relativity. Can effect precede cause? Can information exist without origin? What happens to free will in a universe where the future has already happened? The Bootstrap Paradox found particularly fertile ground in the world of science fiction because it speaks to something fundamental about the act of creation itself. Every story is, in a sense, a causal loop. The ending influences how we understand the beginning, and rereading transforms the first page into something different than it was before. Writers understand intuitively what physicists would later formalize, that time might not be the simple, one-way street our daily experience suggests. As these ideas percolated through popular culture, they began to influence how we think about time itself. Television shows like The Twilight Zone and Doctor Who brought these paradoxes into living rooms around the world, making millions of minds contemplate the possibility of circular causality. The Bootstrap Paradox became not just a scientific or philosophical concept, but a cultural touchstone, a shared vocabulary for discussing the mysteries of time and existence. Through story and screen, humanity was preparing itself for the strange revelations that physics would soon unveil about the nature of space-time itself. In the quiet moments of our daily existence, we live within an architecture of cause and effect so fundamental that we rarely pause to examine its blueprints. Every morning, the sun rises because the earth has rotated. The coffee brews because heat has been applied to water and grounds, and our thoughts emerge from the electrochemical cascades in our neural networks. This is the arrow of causality, always pointing from past to future, as reliable as gravity and as constant as the speed of light. Yet tonight, as we prepare to understand how the Bootstrap Paradox challenges this architecture, let us first appreciate the elegant simplicity of the causal structures that govern our familiar world. The universe, as we experience it, is a vast tapestry of causes and effects, each thread connecting to others in an intricate pattern that stretches from the Big Bang to the heat death of the cosmos. When we drop a stone into a still pond, ripples spread outward in perfect circles, each wave caused by the one before it, the energy dissipating according to precise mathematical laws. This is causality in its purest form, clear, traceable, and unambiguous. The stone's impact causes the first wave, which causes the second, which causes the third, in a beautiful chain of consequence that never doubles back on itself. This directional nature of causality is intimately connected to one of the most profound laws in physics, the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy or disorder always increases in isolated systems. Like a cosmic accountant that never makes mistakes, this law ensures that time has a direction, that there is a meaningful difference between past and future. A glass shatters into 1,000 pieces, but those pieces never spontaneously reassemble into a glass. Cream swirls into coffee, but never unswirls back into separate liquids. These everyday observations are manifestations of a deep truth about our universe, that causality flows in one direction like a river that knows only how to run downhill. Our brains have evolved as prediction machines, constantly building models of cause and effect to navigate the world. When our ancient ancestors saw dark clouds gathering, they knew rain would follow. When they planted seeds, they expected plants to grow. This ability to recognize patterns of causation and to project them into the future is perhaps consciousness's greatest achievement. We are beings who live suspended between memory and anticipation, using the causal chains of the past to prepare for the causal chains of the future. Yet even in our ordinary experience, there are hints that causality might not be as simple as it appears. Consider the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, where two particles, separated by vast distances, seem to influence each other instantaneously, as if causality could sometimes take shortcuts through the fabric of space. Or think about how our expectations shape our reality. The placebo effect, self-fulfilling prophecies, the observer effect in quantum mechanics. These phenomena suggest that the architecture of causality might have secret passages and hidden dimensions that our everyday experience doesn't reveal. The physicists' understanding of causality is encoded in something called the light cone, a beautiful geometric representation of what can influence what in space-time. Imagine every event in the universe as a point with two cones extending from it, one into the past and one into the future. The past light cone contains all the events that could have caused this moment. The future light cone contains all the events that this moment could cause. Nothing outside these cones can be causally connected to the present moment. They are beyond the reach of cause and effect, existing in what physicists call elsewhere, a realm of events that cannot influence or be influenced by the here and now. This light cone structure seems to prohibit the kind of causal loops that the Bootstrap Paradox requires for something to be its own cause. It would need to send information or influence from its future light cone back into its past light cone, creating what physicists call a closed time-like curve. In our everyday experience of space-time, such curves don't exist. They would be like rivers that flow uphill or shadows that precede their objects. And yet, as we're about to discover in our continuing journey, the mathematics of Einstein's general relativity doesn't explicitly forbid such curves. In fact, under certain extreme conditions, near rotating black holes, within traversable wormholes, in universes filled with exotic matter, these impossible loops become mathematically possible, like doors opening in the walls of causality itself, leading to rooms where effect and cause dance together in eternal circles, neither leading nor following, simply existing in a timeless embrace. In 1915, as the world was consumed by the flames of the First World War, Albert Einstein was completing perhaps the most beautiful equation ever written, the field equation of general relativity. Like a cosmic poet, he had discovered that mass and energy don't just exist within space and time, they sculpt it, bend it, weave it into curves and valleys, like an invisible landscape of possibility. And hidden within the elegant mathematics of his discovery, sleeping like seeds waiting for the right season, were solutions that would challenge our most fundamental assumptions about causality itself. Tonight, we drift into the realm where space-time becomes so twisted that the future can whisper to the past. General relativity revealed to us that space-time is not the rigid stage upon which the cosmic drama unfolds, but rather a fluid, dynamic actor in the play itself. Massive objects, like stars and planets, create depressions in the fabric of space-time, like bowling balls resting on a stretched rubber sheet. Other objects, moving through this curved landscape, follow paths that we perceive as gravitational attraction. But Einstein's equations, in their mathematical completeness, also allowed for more exotic configurations, geometries of space-time so extreme that they could, in principle, create bridges between different moments in time. Picture, if you will, space-time as a vast ocean, usually flowing in one direction from past to future. But just as the ocean can have whirlpools and currents that circle back on themselves, space-time too can, under the right conditions, form what physicists call closed time-like curves, CTCs. These are paths through space-time that loop back to their own beginning, like cosmic möbius strips, where a traveler moving always forward through their own time would eventually arrive at their own past. It's as if the universe itself could tie knots in the flow of causality, creating pockets where the normal rules of before and after no longer apply. The first person to discover these temporal loops hidden in Einstein's equations was not Einstein himself, but his close friend, and perhaps the greatest logician of the 20th century, Kurt Gödel. In 1949, as a birthday present to Einstein, Gödel presented a solution to the field equations that described a rotating universe, a cosmos spinning like a vast celestial dancer. And in this spinning universe, Gödel showed there would exist closed time-like curves. Time travel, the stuff of H.G. Wells and science fiction dreams, was suddenly a mathematical possibility endorsed by the most successful theory of gravity ever created. Gödel's rotating universe was like a cosmic whirlpool where the very rotation of all matter and energy would drag space-time around with it, creating spiral paths through time. In such a universe, you could, in principle, travel into your own past simply by taking a long enough journey through space. The mathematics was impeccable, as precise and logical as Gödel's famous incompleteness theorems. Here was proof that Einstein's relativity didn't forbid time travel. It actually provided blueprints for how it might work. Einstein was deeply troubled by his friend's discovery. He had always believed that physics should make sense, that it should describe a universe where causes precede effects, where paradoxes were signs of incomplete understanding rather than fundamental features of reality. Yet here, emerging from his own equations like an uninvited guest, was the possibility of causal loops, of events that could be their own cause. The universe that Einstein had revealed through relativity was stranger than even he had imagined, containing within its mathematical structure the seeds of temporal paradoxes that would haunt physicists for generations. But Gödel's universe, for all its mathematical beauty, didn't match the universe we observe. Our cosmos doesn't appear to be rotating in the way Gödel's solution required. The stars and galaxies don't show the kind of systematic motion that would indicate a universal rotation. It was as if nature had shown us a door to causal loops, but had chosen not to walk through it. Or perhaps, as some physicists began to wonder, the universe had other ways of creating these temporal knots, other geometries that could twist time back on itself. As decades passed, physicists discovered more and more solutions to Einstein's equations that contained closed, time-like curves. Rotating black holes, described by the Kerr metric, were found to have regions near their centers where spacetime becomes so twisted that CTCs might form. Hypothetical constructs like traversable wormholes, shortcuts through spacetime connecting distant regions, could, under certain conditions, be configured to allow travel into the past. Even something as simple as an infinitely long, rotating cylinder of matter could, according to the equations, create CTCs in its vicinity. It was as if general relativity was telling us that time travel and causal loops weren't just possible, but almost inevitable given the right conditions. The universe had written into its most fundamental laws the possibility of effects preceding their causes, of future events reaching back to create their own origins, of bootstrap paradoxes arising naturally from the geometry of spacetime itself. As we drift deeper into the mystery of causal loops, we find that the story becomes even more enchanting when quantum mechanics joins the dance. In the microscopic realm, where particles exist in superposition and uncertainty reigns supreme, the Bootstrap Paradox takes on new dimensions of strangeness and beauty. Here, in the quantum world, we discover that perhaps the universe has built-in mechanisms to preserve causality even when time curves back on itself, like a cosmic immune system protecting against temporal paradoxes. In the 1980s, Russian physicist Igor Novikov proposed something remarkable: the principle of self-consistency. Like a gentle guardian of causality, this principle suggests that the universe somehow ensures that any events on a closed time-like curve are consistent with themselves. In other words, if you could travel back in time, you would find that whatever you do in the past was always part of what happened. The universe, through the mysterious workings of quantum probability, would conspire to prevent paradoxes from arising. It's as if reality itself has a kind of intelligence, a way of selecting only those possibilities that form consistent loops. Imagine a particle traveling backward through time to interact with itself in the past. In classical physics, this could create any number of paradoxes. The particle could prevent its own existence, create multiple versions of itself, or generate logical contradictions that would unravel the fabric of causality. But in quantum mechanics, particles don't have definite positions or momenta. They exist in clouds of probability. When such a probabilistic entity travels through a closed time-like curve, something beautiful happens. The mathematics shows that only certain probability distributions remain stable. Only certain quantum states can exist consistently through the loop. There is something almost musical about how quantum mechanics handles these temporal loops. Just as a violin string can only vibrate at certain frequencies, creating harmonics that reinforce themselves, quantum systems in CTCs can only exist in states that harmoniously reinforce their own existence. The inconsistent possibilities, those that would create paradoxes, destructively interfere with themselves and vanish like dissonant notes that cancel each other out. What remains are the self-consistent solutions, the quantum states that sing in harmony with their own past and future. The quantum universe seems to be telling us that bootstrap paradoxes, rather than being violations of physics, might be natural consequences of how reality organizes itself at the deepest level. Consider quantum entanglement, where two particles remain connected across vast distances, their states correlated in ways that seem to transcend the normal flow of cause and effect. Some physicists have suggested that CTCs might naturally create entanglement between different moments in time, binding past and future together in quantum correlations that ensure consistency. This quantum approach to causal loops also sheds new light on the nature of information in bootstrap paradoxes. In quantum mechanics, information is never truly created or destroyed. It only transforms and evolves according to unitary operations. When information travels through a closed time-like curve, it must preserve this unitarity, meaning that the total amount of information remains constant even as it loops through time. The poems that write themselves, the equations that teach themselves. In the quantum view, they aren't creating information from nothing but rather discovering the only forms that can exist stably in their temporal loops. The marriage of quantum mechanics and general relativity in the context of CTCs reveals something profound about free will and determinism. In a classical bootstrap paradox, It might seem that free will is eliminated. If you travel to the past, you must do exactly what history records, with no freedom to change anything. But quantum mechanics introduces an element of fundamental uncertainty. You don't have to do exactly what happened. Rather, the probabilities must work out such that what you're most likely to do is what did happen. It's a subtle difference, but one that preserves a kind of quantum free will, even within the constraints of self-consistency. Perhaps most fascinatingly, some physicists have proposed that quantum effects might actually make CTCs more stable, rather than less. The quantum vacuum, that seething sea of virtual particles that fills empty space, might respond to the formation of CTCs in ways that reinforce them rather than destroying them. It's as if the universe, at its most fundamental level, is not hostile to causal loops, but rather accommodates them, integrates them into the larger tapestry of quantum reality. The Bootstrap Paradox, seen through quantum eyes, becomes not a problem to be solved, but a feature of how the universe elegantly handles the relationship between cause and effect when time itself becomes circular. In the later decades of the 20th century, as our understanding of space-time grew ever more sophisticated, a remarkable dialogue began between some of the greatest minds in physics about the nature of causality and time travel. Like ancient philosophers gathered in moonlit gardens, except their gardens were universities, and their moonlight was the glow of blackboard equations. These scientists wrestled with the implications of closed time-like curves and the bootstrap paradoxes. Their debate would fundamentally shape how we think about the possibility and impossibility of causal loops in our universe. Kip Thorne, the gentle giant of gravitational physics, became fascinated with the possibility of traversable wormholes in the 1980s, inspired by his friend Carl Sagan, who needed a scientifically plausible method of faster-than-light travel for his novel, Contact. Thorne and his students began to seriously investigate whether wormholes, shortcuts through space-time, could exist within the framework of general relativity. What they discovered was both exciting and troubling. Yes, wormholes were theoretically possible, but maintaining them would require something called exotic matter, a substance with negative energy density that had never been observed. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn into bootstrap territory. Thorne realized that if you could create a traversable wormhole and move one mouth of it at high speed relative to the other, time dilation would cause the two mouths to become desynchronized in time. One mouth would age more slowly than the other, creating a tunnel not just through space, but through time itself. You could enter one mouth and emerge from the other in your own past, creating the perfect conditions for bootstrap paradoxes to arise. A manuscript could be passed through the wormhole to its own author before it was written. An invention could be delivered to its inventor before it was conceived. Thorne didn't shy away from these implications. Instead, he embraced them with scientific rigor, working out the mathematics of what he called chronology-violating space-times. He showed that the laws of physics, as we understood them, didn't explicitly forbid these causal loops. The equations were clear. Given the right conditions, bootstrap paradoxes could exist in our universe. It was as if nature had left a door open, even if that door required exotic materials to prop it open. Enter Stephen Hawking, with his brilliant mind and characteristic wit, proposing what he called the chronology protection conjecture. Like a cosmic sheriff, maintaining order in the universe, Hawking suggested that the laws of physics always conspire to prevent the formation of closed, time-like curves, at least on macroscopic scales. His argument was subtle and beautiful. Whenever conditions might allow for the formation of CTCs, quantum effects would become so strong that they would destroy the would-be time machine before it could operate. Hawking envisioned quantum fluctuations, the endless dance of virtual particles in the vacuum, becoming amplified near any would-be CTC. These fluctuations would circulate through the loop, gaining energy with each pass, like sound waves creating feedback in a microphone system. Eventually, this quantum feedback would become so intense that it would either destroy the CTC or prevent it from forming in the first place. The universe, Hawking suggested, protects itself against paradoxes through a kind of quantum censorship, making the world safe for historians, as he playfully put it. But the debate didn't end there. Other physicists, like Igor Novikov and Valery Frolov, argued that Hawking's chronology protection might not be absolute. They showed that under certain conditions, the quantum fluctuations might remain bounded, allowing CTCs to exist without destroying themselves. The universe might permit causal loops, but only those that are self-consistent, that don't create paradoxes. It was as if nature had a more nuanced approach, not banning time travel outright, but ensuring that any time travel that did occur would be woven seamlessly into the fabric of history. This ongoing dialogue between possibility and impossibility reveals something profound about how science grapples with the limits of reality. Here were some of the smartest humans who ever lived, using the most sophisticated mathematical tools ever developed, trying to determine whether the universe permits effects to precede their causes. The fact that the question remains open, that the mathematics allows for such possibilities, even if the physical world might not, tells us that we still don't fully understand the deepest nature of time and causality. The debate between Thorne's traversable wormholes and Hawking's chronology protection continues to this day, with each new calculation and thought experiment adding another layer to our understanding. Some physicists have proposed that the resolution might lie in a theory of quantum gravity, the long-sought unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics. Perhaps when we finally understand how space-time itself becomes quantum at the smallest scales, we'll discover whether bootstrap paradoxes are forbidden mysteries or natural features of the cosmic architecture. Let us now drift into the realm of thought experiments, those beautiful gardens of the mind where physicists and philosophers plant impossible seeds to see what might grow. In contemplating the Bootstrap Paradox, some of the most elegant and troubling thought experiments ever conceived have blossomed, each one illuminating different facets of what it means for something to be its own cause. These mental explorations are like dreams shared between brilliant minds, dreams that probe the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. Consider first the haunting tale of Beethoven's violin. Though it could be any object, the choice of a musical instrument adds a poetic resonance to the paradox. Imagine a music lover who travels back to 1800 to meet Beethoven, carrying with her a violin that she believes is one of the master's creations. She presents it to the young composer as a gift, telling him it will inspire great works. Beethoven, touched by this gesture, keeps the violin throughout his life, and it indeed inspires some of his most beautiful compositions. The violin is eventually donated to a museum, where centuries later, our time traveler first encounters it before taking it back to give to Beethoven. The question that haunts us like a melody we can't forget: who made the violin? It has no creator, no moment of construction, no craftsman who selected the wood and shaped it with loving care. It exists in an eternal loop, forever traveling from future to past and back again. Even more unsettling, the violin ages continuously through its loop. Each cycle adds wear and tear, yet it must remain exactly the same violin that completes the loop. How can something age forever, yet never decay? How can it accumulate scratches and patina, yet always be in exactly the condition needed to inspire Beethoven and eventually travel back? But physical objects are just the beginning of the mystery. Consider the even more troubling case of information without origin, the equation that teaches itself. A physics student in 2050 discovers in an old notebook a set of equations that perfectly describe quantum gravity, the holy grail of physics. She studies them, comes to understand their profound implications, and builds a time machine based on principles they reveal. She then travels back to 2025 and, either deliberately or accidentally, leaves the notebook where a young physics student, herself 30 years younger, will find it. This thought experiment cuts to the heart of what troubles us most about bootstrap paradoxes: the creation of information from nothing. These equations, which might represent humanity's greatest intellectual achievement, were never derived, never discovered through years of calculation and inspiration. They simply exist, teaching themselves to successive generations in an endless loop. The information they contain, perhaps the fundamental laws of the universe itself, has no author, no moment of insight, no eureka in a bathtub. They are orphans of causality, knowledge without a knower who first knew it. The paradox becomes even more acute when we consider what physicists call the information paradox of bootstrap loops. Information, in the modern physics understanding, is a physical quantity, as real as energy or momentum. It takes energy to create information, to maintain it, to transmit it. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that information has entropic cost. There's no free lunch in the information universe. Yet here, in these causal loops, information seems to exist without ever paying this thermodynamic price. The equations in the notebook, the notes of Beethoven's compositions inspired by the paradoxical violin, the very atoms and molecules of looped objects, all carry information that was never created in the conventional sense. Some physicists have proposed even more elaborate thought experiments to probe the boundaries of bootstrap paradoxes. Imagine a computer program that writes itself. A traveler brings back a piece of software from the future, which turns out to be the code that will eventually be developed based on studying that very same software. Or consider a language that teaches itself words and grammar rules that exist only because they were brought back from a future where they were already spoken, with no original moment of linguistic creation. These thought experiments reveal something profound about the nature of creativity and causation in our normal experience. Every creation has a creator. Every idea has a thinker who first thought it. Every pattern has a pattern maker. But bootstrap paradoxes suggest a universe where some patterns might be self-creating, self-sustaining, existing not because they were made, but because they are the only forms that can exist consistently in their causal loops. It's as if the universe contains strange attractors in the space of possibilities, configurations that draw themselves into existence through the sheer fact of their self-consistency. Perhaps most unsettling of all is the thought experiment of the bootstrap consciousness, a mind that creates itself. Imagine an artificial intelligence that is sent back in time as code, which is then used to create the very computer system that will eventually develop that same AI. The consciousness, the patterns of thought, the very essence of awareness would exist in a causal loop, with no moment of first awakening, no gradual development from simpler systems. It would be a mind that has always existed, thinking thoughts that create themselves, dreaming dreams that dream the dreamer into being. As we descend deeper into the heart of the bootstrap paradox, we encounter one of the most profound questions in modern physics. What exactly is information, and how does it behave when caught in the circular currents of a causal loop? Tonight, let us contemplate information not as abstract symbols or mere patterns of meaning, but as a physical entity as real as matter and energy, subject to the laws of thermodynamics, yet seemingly able to violate them within the strange realm of temporal paradoxes. In the quiet revolution of 20th century physics, information transformed from an abstract concept to a fundamental component of reality. Claude Shannon showed us that information could be measured in bits, while physicists like Rolf Landauer demonstrated that information processing has unavoidable physical consequences. Every bit of information, Landauer proved, requires a minimum amount of energy to erase, a principle now known as Landauer's limit. Information isn't just something we know, it's something that exists, that has weight in the cosmic accounting of energy and entropy. Consider the profound implications of this understanding. When you remember a sunset, the memory isn't just a poetic abstraction, it's a physical configuration of neurons, a pattern maintained against the constant tide of entropy by the expenditure of metabolic energy. When a computer stores a file, it's creating a physical state that requires energy to maintain and would eventually decay without constant refresh. Information, we've learned, is carved into the very fabric of the physical world, as real as the atoms that encode it. This is what makes the bootstrap paradox so deeply troubling from a thermodynamic perspective. The second law of thermodynamics, that entropy always increases in isolated systems, seems to be the most inviolable law in physics. It's the law that gives time its arrow, that makes the past different from the future, that ensures that every action has a cost in the currency of entropy. Yet here, in bootstrap paradoxes, we find information that seems to exist without ever paying this entropic price. Imagine again our self-teaching equation, that mathematical formula that travels through time in an endless loop, teaching itself to successive generations. From a thermodynamic perspective, this information should degrade with each cycle. Every time it's written down, read, understood, and transmitted, there should be copying errors, noise, gradual decay. It's like a message whispered from person to person in an infinite game of telephone. Thermodynamics insists that the message must eventually become garbled beyond recognition. Yet, the Bootstrap Paradox requires the information to remain perfectly preserved, cycle after cycle, forever. Some physicists have proposed that the resolution might lie in understanding information not just as a pattern, but as a relationship between possible states. In this view, the information in a bootstrap loop doesn't violate thermodynamics because it was never created in the traditional sense. It simply represents the only configuration that can exist self-consistently in that particular causal structure. It's as if the universe has pockets where information can exist in a kind of thermodynamic equilibrium, neither gaining nor losing entropy, frozen in eternal patterns that maintain themselves through the very structure of space-time. But there's something even more mysterious at play. Recent developments in quantum information theory suggest that information might be the most fundamental aspect of reality, more basic even than matter or energy. John Wheeler captured this in his famous phrase, "it from bit," the idea that all physical entities are information theoretic in origin. If this is true, then bootstrap paradoxes might be revealing something profound about the nature of reality itself, that some information patterns are self-creating, self-sustaining, existing not because they were made, but because they are mathematically necessary features of the universe. The black hole information paradox adds another layer to this mystery. When matter falls into a black hole, the information it carries seems to be destroyed, violating the principle of quantum unitarity, which states that information must be preserved. Stephen Hawking's discovery that black holes evaporate through quantum radiation made this paradox even more acute. But recent theories suggest that information might be preserved on the event horizon, encoded holographically on the two-dimensional surface rather than in the three-dimensional volume. This holographic principle might also apply to bootstrap paradoxes. Perhaps the information in causal loops is preserved not in the ordinary flow of time, but encoded in the very geometry of the closed time-like curves themselves. Consider the possibility that bootstrap paradoxes might actually be revealing a deeper conservation law, not just conservation of energy or momentum, but conservation of information itself. In this view, the universe maintains a cosmic ledger where all information must balance, where nothing is truly created or destroyed, only transformed and recirculated. The self-teaching equations, the authorless books, the uncreated objects, they might all be manifestations of this deeper principle, information that exists because the universe's accounting demands it, patterns that emerge from the mathematical necessity of self-consistency in the grand equation of existence. Let us now drift into what may be the most breathtaking solution to the bootstrap paradox, the possibility that our universe is not alone, but rather one thread in an infinite tapestry of parallel realities. In the quantum mechanical interpretation known as the many worlds hypothesis, every quantum event splits the universe into multiple versions, each following a different possible outcome. Tonight, we explore how this proliferation of realities might resolve the paradoxes of causal loops, transforming them from logical impossibilities into natural features of a multiverse where every possible story is simultaneously told. The many worlds interpretation proposed by Hugh Everett III in 1957 suggests something so audacious that it took decades for physicists to take it seriously. Every time a quantum measurement occurs, every time a particle chooses between possible states, the universe doesn't actually choose. It splits, creating parallel branches where each possibility becomes real. In one universe, the electron spins up. In another, it spins down. In one universe, the radioactive atom decays. In another, it remains stable. We experience only one branch, but all branches are equally real, spreading out like an infinite tree of realities, growing through the dimension of possibility. When we apply this multiversal perspective to Bootstrap paradoxes, something remarkable happens. The grandfather paradox, where a time traveler might prevent their own birth, dissolves like morning mist. If you travel back in time and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you don't create a logical contradiction. Instead, you create a new branch of reality, one where you were never born in that timeline, but where you still exist as a visitor from another branch. The universe splits, accommodating both histories without paradox. But the Bootstrap paradox presents a subtler challenge to the multiverse solution. In a standard Bootstrap loop, there's no obvious change being made to history, no clear point where the universe would split. The violin that inspires Beethoven, the equation that teaches itself, these seem to require a single, self-consistent timeline rather than multiple branches. Yet, perhaps this is exactly where the elegance of the multiverse solution reveals itself most beautifully. Imagine that every possible version of the Bootstrap loop exists across different universal branches. In one universe, the violin is slightly different, perhaps a scratch in a different place, a slightly different tone. In another, the equations contain a subtle variation, an alternative formulation that's mathematically equivalent, but symbolically distinct. Across the infinite branches of the multiverse, every possible self-consistent loop plays out. What we experience as a single Bootstrap paradox is actually a kind of quantum superposition of all possible self-consistent histories, a standing wave in the ocean of parallel realities. This multiversal perspective transforms the Bootstrap paradox from a violation of causality into a selection principle. The loops we observe are those that remain stable across multiple branches, configurations that reinforce themselves not just through time, but across the dimension of parallel possibilities. It's as if the multiverse performs a kind of natural selection on causal loops, with only the most robust, self-consistent patterns surviving the transition from quantum possibility to classical reality. The mathematical elegance of this solution is breathtaking. In quantum mechanics, we use something called a path integral to calculate probabilities. We sum over all possible paths a particle might take, with each path contributing to the final probability amplitude. When closed time-like curves are involved, this path integral must include paths that loop through time. The mathematics shows that destructive interference eliminates inconsistent loops, while constructive interference amplifies consistent ones. The multiverse doesn't just allow Bootstrap paradoxes, it naturally generates them through the self-organizing principles of quantum mechanics. Some physicists have proposed even more exotic multiversal solutions. Perhaps bootstrap loops are actually connections between different universes, wormholes in the space of possibilities rather than just in space-time. The violin exists without a creator because it's a bridge object, something that belongs not to any single universe, but to the relationship between universes. The self-teaching equations might be mathematical truths that exist independently of any particular reality, patterns that manifest themselves wherever the conditions allow, like crystals forming wherever the temperature and pressure are right. There's something deeply comforting about the multiverse solution to bootstrap paradoxes. It suggests that the universe, or rather, the multiverse, is fundamentally resistant to logical contradictions. Every possibility, every story, every potential history has its place in the infinite library of parallel realities. The Bootstrap Paradox, rather than being a flaw in the cosmic code, becomes a feature, a way for information and objects to exist across multiple timelines, binding different branches of reality together in loops of mutual causation. Yet, the multiverse solution also raises profound questions about the nature of existence itself. If every possible version of a bootstrap loop exists somewhere in the multiverse, what does it mean to say that something is its own cause? Perhaps causation itself is a more subtle concept than we imagine, not a simple arrow from past to future, but a complex web of relationships spanning multiple dimensions of time and possibility. In this view, the bootstrap paradox isn't really a paradox at all, but a glimpse of how causality actually works in a reality far stranger and more beautiful than our everyday experience suggests. Perhaps no aspect of the bootstrap paradox is more haunting than the question of consciousness caught in a causal loop. As we drift into this deepest mystery, we confront questions that have puzzled philosophers and physicists alike. What happens to personal identity when past and future become circular? Can free will exist in a universe where your future self has already influenced your past? Tonight, we explore the strange landscape where consciousness meets circular time, where the observer becomes entangled with the observed in loops of self-creating awareness. Imagine, if you will, a consciousness traveling through a closed time-like curve, not just a body moving through space-time, but an aware, thinking, feeling, being carrying memories, experiences, and the ineffable sense of self through a loop in causality. This consciousness would face a unique existential situation, meeting younger versions of itself, perhaps even influencing its own development, creating the very experiences that shaped it into the being capable of making that journey. It's a recursion of identity, a self that creates itself through its own future actions. The question of memory becomes particularly poignant in these scenarios. Our sense of self is largely constructed from our memories, the continuous narrative we tell ourselves about who we are, where we've been, what we've experienced. But in a bootstrap loop, memories could become paradoxical. You might remember events that haven't happened yet from your perspective, but have already occurred from the universe's perspective. You might carry memories of teaching yourself knowledge that you're simultaneously learning for the first time. The linear story of a life would become a circle with no clear beginning or end, no definitive first experience or original memory. Consider the profound implications for free will. In our ordinary experience, we feel we have choices, that we can influence the future through our decisions. But if you're in a bootstrap loop, traveling back to participate in events that have already occurred, do you have any freedom at all? Must you do exactly what history records? Becoming an actor, playing a role that's already been written? Or perhaps free will itself is more subtle than we imagine, not the ability to change what happens, but the experience of choosing what was always going to be chosen, the subjective feeling of decision making, even in a deterministic loop. Some philosophers have suggested that bootstrap paradoxes might actually illuminate the true nature of consciousness itself. Perhaps consciousness isn't a linear progression from birth to death, but something more like a standing wave in space-time, a pattern that exists across our entire world line simultaneously. In this view, the feeling of now, of being present in a particular moment, is just how it feels to be a four-dimensional pattern in space-time, experiencing itself from within. Bootstrap loops would then be places where this pattern curves back on itself, where consciousness can experience its own timeless nature more directly. The observer effect in quantum mechanics adds another layer to this mystery. In quantum physics, the act of observation seems to collapse probability waves into definite states. But what happens when the observer is also the observed? When consciousness loops back to observe its own quantum past, some theories suggest that consciousness might play a fundamental role in selecting which of many possible bootstrap loops becomes real. The universe might require conscious observers to witness their own causal loops, to collapse the quantum superposition of possible histories into a single, self-consistent timeline. There's something almost mystical about the idea of a consciousness that creates itself. Yet modern physics suggests this might not be as impossible as it seems. Consider that our brains are constantly predicting their own future states, using those predictions to guide present actions. In a sense, we're always in small bootstrap loops, with our anticipated future selves influencing our present decisions, which create those very futures. A bootstrap paradox might simply be an extreme version of this self-fulfilling prophecy of consciousness, where the loop extends not just seconds or minutes into the future, but years or decades through curved space-time. The question of identity in bootstrap loops touches on one of the deepest problems in philosophy of mind. What makes you you from one moment to the next? If a consciousness travels through a closed, time-like curve, meeting and influencing its younger self, are these two versions the same person or different people? The paradox forces us to confront the possibility that personal identity might be more fluid than we imagine, that the boundaries of self might be conventions we impose on a reality where consciousness flows through time like water through a twisted garden hose, sometimes doubling back on itself, sometimes flowing in circles. Some physicists have proposed that consciousness might actually be necessary for bootstrap paradoxes to exist. Perhaps the universe only allows causal loops that include conscious observers, beings capable of experiencing and remembering the loop, of providing what we might call witnessed consistency. In this view, consciousness isn't just accidentally caught up in bootstrap paradoxes. It's an essential component, the thread that weaves the loop together, the awareness that gives meaning to the circular causality. Without consciousness to experience it, a bootstrap loop might be just a mathematical abstraction, a possibility that never quite becomes real. As we near the deep waters of our contemplation, we encounter a fundamental barrier. The very tools we use to think and communicate about bootstrap paradoxes seem inadequate to the task. Language, evolved to describe a world of linear time and clear causation, stutters and fails when confronted with causal loops. Logic, our most precise tool for reasoning, finds itself twisted into knots when effect precedes cause. Tonight, we explore the boundaries of human comprehension, the places where our cognitive architecture meets its limits, and the new conceptual frameworks we might need to truly understand temporal paradoxes. Our language is saturated with temporal assumptions. Every verb carries within it the arrow of time. We remember the past, experience the present, anticipate the future. We speak of causes leading to effects, of events following one another, of time flowing from earlier to later. These linguistic structures aren't just conventions, they reflect the deep architecture of how our brains process reality. We are beings evolved in a world where time moves in one direction, where causes precede effects, where stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. But when we try to describe bootstrap paradoxes, our language becomes a prison. How do we speak of something that is simultaneously cause and effect? What tense do we use for an event that hasn't happened yet, but already has happened? The sentence, "The violin was given to Beethoven by someone who got it from Beethoven," makes grammatical sense, but semantic nonsense. Our words circle around the paradox without ever quite capturing it, like trying to describe a color that doesn't exist in our visual spectrum. Consider the logical foundations we use to reason about reality. Classical logic is built on principles like the law of non-contradiction. Something cannot be both true and false simultaneously. The law of excluded middle tells us that every proposition must be either true or false. But bootstrap paradoxes seem to exist in a logical twilight zone where these principles blur. Is the equation discovered or invented? Did the time traveler change the past, or was their arrival always part of it? The questions themselves reveal the inadequacy of binary logic to handle circular causation. Temporal logic, developed by philosophers and computer scientists to reason about time-dependent truths, offers some help, but ultimately falls short. These formal systems can handle statements like, "It will always be true that," or "It was once true that," but they still assume a linear flow of time. When we try to apply temporal logic to closed time-like curves, we get formal contradictions, or have to introduce ad hoc rules that feel more like patches than genuine solutions. The mathematics might work, but the meaning remains elusive. Some philosophers have suggested that we need entirely new categories of thought to properly conceive of bootstrap paradoxes, just as quantum mechanics required us to abandon classical notions of determinacy and locality. Perhaps understanding causal loops requires abandoning our intuitive notions of identity, causation, and existence. We might need to think in terms of retrocausation, causation that works backward in time, or block time, where all moments exist simultaneously in a four-dimensional space-time structure. The challenge goes deeper than just finding the right words or logical framework. Our brains themselves are products of evolution in a world of linear time. Our neural networks are prediction machines, constantly using past experience to anticipate future events. This temporal asymmetry is built into our cognitive architecture at the deepest level. Asking a human brain to truly comprehend a bootstrap paradox might be like asking a two-dimensional being to visualize a three-dimensional object. We can work with projections and analogies, but the full reality remains beyond our direct comprehension. Yet perhaps this limitation is also an opportunity. The history of physics is full of moments where our intuition failed us, where reality proved stranger than we could imagine, and where we had to develop new mathematical and conceptual tools to make progress. Non-Euclidean geometry seemed absurd until it became the foundation of general relativity. Quantum superposition defied common sense until it became the basis of our most successful physical theory. Bootstrap paradoxes might be pushing us toward another conceptual revolution, forcing us to develop new ways of thinking about time, causation, and existence. Some physicists and philosophers have proposed that we might need to adopt what they call timeless physics, describing the universe not as something that evolves through time, but as a static, four-dimensional structure, where time is just another coordinate, like space. In this view, bootstrap paradoxes aren't paradoxical at all. They're just interesting patterns in the fixed geometry of space-time, no more mysterious than a river that winds back on itself. The paradox only arises when we try to impose our psychological experience of temporal flow onto a reality that might be fundamentally timeless. There's something both humbling and beautiful about encountering the limits of our understanding. Bootstrap paradoxes remind us that the universe might be fundamentally stranger than we're capable of fully comprehending. That reality might contain possibilities that our evolution hasn't prepared us to grasp. Yet we continue to push against these boundaries, using mathematics as a ladder to climb beyond our intuition, using imagination to explore territories our senses cannot reach. In struggling to understand bootstrap paradoxes, we're not just solving puzzles in physics. We're expanding the boundaries of human thought itself, reaching toward new ways of comprehending a cosmos that continues to surprise us with its depth and mystery. As we drift through the corridors of human culture, we discover that the bootstrap paradox has always been with us, whispering through our myths, our art, and our deepest stories about the nature of existence. Long before physicists gave it a name, before mathematicians described its geometry, the human imagination was already dancing with circular time, with effects that create their causes, with endings that birth beginnings. Tonight, we explore how this paradox resonates through the collective consciousness of our species, manifesting in symbols and stories that seem to arise from some deep, intuitive understanding that time might not be the simple arrow we perceive. The Ouroboros, that ancient symbol of a serpent swallowing its own tail, emerges from the mists of prehistory like a premonition of the bootstrap paradox, found in Egyptian tombs, carved into Norse runestones, painted in alchemical manuscripts, drawn in the sand by Aboriginal dreamkeepers. This image appears independently across cultures, separated by vast oceans and millennia. There is something almost uncanny about how universally humans have been drawn to this symbol of circular causation, as if our collective unconscious always knew that somewhere in the architecture of reality, endings and beginnings might be one and the same. In the mythologies of the world, we find countless echoes of bootstrap-like paradoxes. The Norse cosmos speaks of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, which is simultaneously an ending and a beginning, with the world being destroyed and reborn in an eternal cycle. Hindu cosmology describes the universe as the dream of Brahma, who dreams himself into existence, creating a reality that creates its creator. The ancient Greeks told of the phoenix, a bird that gives birth to itself through its own destruction, its ashes becoming the egg from which it emerges, forever dying and being reborn in a loop that has no first iteration. Literature, that laboratory of human imagination, has been particularly fertile ground for exploring bootstrap paradoxes. Jorge Luis Borges, that master of literary labyrinths, wrote stories where books contain themselves, where authors discover they are characters in their own fiction, where time circles back like a garden of forking paths that somehow all lead to the same destination. In The Circular Ruins, he tells of a man who dreams another man into existence only to discover that he himself is someone else's dream. Creation and creator, locked in an infinite recursion of imagination. Modern science fiction has transformed the bootstrap paradox into a cultural touchstone. The film Predestination presents a character who is their own mother, father, and child, a complete causal loop of identity. Dark, the German television series, weaves multiple bootstrap paradoxes into a tapestry where objects, information, and even people exist without origin, maintaining themselves through the sheer necessity of their role in the timeline. These stories don't just entertain, they prepare our minds for possibilities that physics is only beginning to explore, using narrative to stretch our conceptual boundaries. But perhaps the most profound cultural echo of the bootstrap paradox is found in our music, a song that samples itself, a melody that seems to have always existed, a rhythm that creates the very heartbeat it follows. Musicians have long understood something that physicists are only now formalizing. Bach's fugues, with their self-referential structures, create musical bootstrap paradoxes, where themes generate variations that regenerate the original theme. The minimalist compositions of Steve Reich and Philip Glassloop and Phase, creating patterns where it becomes impossible to identify what is cause and what is effect, what is original and what is echo. There's something deeply psychological about our attraction to these circular causalities. Perhaps it speaks to our experience of consciousness itself, which seems to observe itself observing, creating the strange loop of self-awareness. When we say, "I think, therefore I am," we're already in a kind of bootstrap paradox. The I that thinks is proven to exist by the thinking that the I performs. Consciousness creates itself through its own self-recognition, a cognitive Ouroboros that psychologists and philosophers still struggle to understand. The visual arts, too, have long been fascinated with these paradoxes. M.C. Escher's impossible constructions, his hands drawing themselves, his staircases that climb forever while going nowhere, visualize bootstrap paradoxes in ways that bypass language and logic to speak directly to our spatial intuition. His lithograph, Print Gallery, shows a man looking at a picture that contains the gallery, that contains the man looking at the picture, a perfect visual representation of a causal loop. that would make any physicist contemplating closed time-like curves feel a shock of recognition. In our digital age, the Bootstrap Paradox has found new expressions. Video games with time loop mechanics, where players must use knowledge from future iterations to solve puzzles in the past, train us to think in bootstrap logic. Virtual reality experiences that place us inside recursive environments, where we can interact with our own past and future selves, make the paradox not just conceptual, but experiential. We are teaching ourselves, through play and art, to be comfortable with causalities that our ancestors would have found incomprehensible. What does it mean that humans, across all cultures and throughout all history, have been drawn to these patterns of circular causation? Perhaps it suggests that linear time, despite being our everyday experience, isn't the only temporal truth we can perceive. Maybe in our dreams, in our creativity, in those moments when consciousness seems to step outside itself, we touch something deeper, a reality where time is not a river, but an ocean, not an arrow, but a web, where causes and effects dance together in eternal loops that have always been spinning, waiting for us to develop the mathematics and physics to finally describe what our hearts and minds have always, somehow, known. As we stand at the threshold of a new era in physics, the Bootstrap Paradox emerges not as a mere curiosity, but as a potential key to unlocking some of the deepest mysteries of the universe. The coming decades promise revolutionary developments in our understanding of time, causality, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Tonight, we drift into the future of physics, where quantum computers might process information through temporal loops, where theories of quantum gravity might naturally incorporate circular causation, and where the Bootstrap Paradox might transform from paradox to principle. The emergence of quantum computing opens unprecedented possibilities for exploring bootstrap paradoxes. These machines, which harness quantum superposition and entanglement to process information in ways classical computers cannot, might be capable of simulating closed time-like curves. Some theoretical physicists have already proposed quantum algorithms that would essentially compute through time loops, solving problems by sending information to their own past states. Imagine a quantum computer that could find the solution to a problem by receiving the answer from its future self, which computed it by receiving it from its future self, in an endless loop of computational causality. David Deutsch, one of the pioneers of quantum computing, has proposed that quantum computers with access to closed time-like curves, called CTC quantum computers, would be exponentially more powerful than ordinary quantum computers. They could solve problems that are not just difficult, but formally undecidable in normal computation. It's as if the Bootstrap Paradox, rather than being a bug in the universe's operating system, might be a feature that allows for computational possibilities beyond our current imagination. These hypothetical machines wouldn't just calculate, they would reach through time to pluck answers from the space of self-consistent solutions. The quest for quantum gravity, the long-sought theory that would unify general relativity with quantum mechanics, might find in bootstrap paradoxes not an obstacle, but an essential ingredient. String theory, loop, quantum gravity, and other approaches to quantum gravity all suggest that at the smallest scales, space-time itself becomes quantum, fluctuating and uncertain. In such a quantum space-time, closed time-like curves might not be exotic exceptions, but natural features arising wherever quantum fluctuations create the right conditions. Consider how loop quantum gravity, one of the leading candidates for a theory of quantum gravity, already incorporates the concept of loops at its most fundamental level. In this theory, space-time itself is woven from tiny loops of quantum geometry, spinning networks that create the illusion of smooth space and flowing time at larger scales. Bootstrap paradoxes might emerge naturally from these quantum loops, not as violations of causality, but as manifestations of how causality actually works at the Planck scale, where space and time themselves become uncertain and circular. The holographic principle, one of the most profound insights of modern theoretical physics, suggests that all the information in a volume of space can be encoded on its boundary, like a three-dimensional image emerging from a two-dimensional hologram. Some physicists speculate that bootstrap paradoxes might be understood through this holographic lens. The information in a causal loop might not actually be circulating through time, but might be encoded timelessly on some higher dimensional boundary, with the appearance of temporal circulation being merely how this timeless information pattern manifests in our lower dimensional experience. Emergent theories of time suggest something even more radical. That time itself might not be fundamental, but could emerge from more basic, timeless processes. In these theories, what we experience as the flow of time, the arrow of causality, even the distinction between past and future, might all be emergent properties of a deeper reality where these distinctions don't exist. Bootstrap paradoxes, in this view, might be windows into this deeper level, places where the emergent nature of time becomes visible, where we can glimpse the timeless machinery beneath the temporal appearance, the search for a theory of everything, a single framework that would explain all physical phenomena, might require us to fundamentally reconceptualize causation itself. Perhaps causes and effects, rather than being linked in simple chains, are connected in vast networks where influences can flow in any direction, including loops. The universe might be less like a computer program executing linear instructions and more like a vast neural network where feedback loops are essential to its function. Bootstrap paradoxes might be the universe's way of computing its own existence, self-consistent loops in the cosmic algorithm. Quantum biology, an emerging field that studies quantum effects in living systems, has discovered that many biological processes seem to use quantum coherence and entanglement. Some researchers speculate that consciousness itself might involve quantum processes in the brain. If this is true, and if closed time-like curves are possible, we might one day discover that biological systems can create or utilize bootstrap paradoxes. Evolution itself might be understood as a kind of temporal feedback loop where future possibilities influence present adaptations, where life reaches through time to bootstrap itself into greater complexity. The technological implications stretch beyond pure science into the realm of human possibility. If we can understand and harness bootstrap paradoxes, we might develop forms of communication that transcend normal temporal limitations, computers that solve problems by consulting their future states, or even ways to access information that hasn't been created yet in the conventional sense. The paradox that once seemed to threaten our understanding of causality might become a tool for transcending the limitations that causality has always imposed on us. As our contemplation deepens into the quiet hours, we must acknowledge that for all our theories and thought experiments, for all our mathematics and imagination, the Bootstrap Paradox remains wrapped in profound mysteries. These are not merely puzzles awaiting clever solutions, but might represent fundamental limits to human knowledge, boundaries where our understanding dissolves into uncertainty. Tonight, we embrace these mysteries, not as failures, but as invitations to wonder, reminders that the universe is far stranger and more beautiful than we may ever fully comprehend. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics becomes particularly acute when we consider bootstrap paradoxes. In ordinary quantum mechanics, measurement causes the wave function to collapse from superposition to a definite state. But what happens when the measurement apparatus is caught in a causal loop? If an observer in the future measures a quantum system and sends the result back to influence the past state of that same system, we have a situation where the measurement both causes and is caused by the state it measures. The wave function would need to collapse to a state that ensures its own measurement, a kind of quantum bootstrap that current interpretations of quantum mechanics struggle to accommodate. Consider the deeper question of what determines which self-consistent loops actually occur. In principle, there might be many different ways for a causal loop to be self-consistent. Multiple sets of equations could teach themselves. Different objects could exist without creators. Various patterns of information could circulate through time, yet presumably, only one actually happens. What selects the particular bootstrap paradox that manifests from the space of all possible self-consistent loops? Is there some principle, as yet undiscovered, that determines which potential paradoxes become actual, or do all possible loops occur somewhere in a vast multiverse, with our experience being just one path through an infinite garden of circular causalities? The relationship between entropy and bootstrap paradoxes remains one of the most troubling mysteries. The second law of thermodynamics seems inviolable. Entropy always increases. Information degrades. Order dissolves into chaos. Yet bootstrap paradoxes seem to require perfect information preservation through potentially infinite cycles. Some physicists propose that the loops might be finite, that they only appear eternal from our perspective, but actually have a finite duration in some higher dimensional view. Others suggest that the entropy is somehow stored outside the loop, accumulating in the broader universe, while the loop itself remains pristine. But these are speculations, mathematical band-aids on a conceptual wound that refuses to heal. Free will presents perhaps the most personally troubling mystery. If bootstrap paradoxes exist, if future events can influence past events, then the entire notion of agency becomes questionable. Are our choices truly free if our future selves have already made them? Do we have any real autonomy if we're caught in causal loops that we're not even aware of? Some philosophers argue that free will is compatible with bootstrap paradoxes, that we can freely choose what was always going to be chosen. Others suggest that free will itself might be the illusion, that our sense of agency is just how it feels to be a self-consistent pattern in space-time. The origin of the laws of physics themselves might be the ultimate bootstrap paradox, Why does the universe have the particular laws it does? Why these constants, these forces, these symmetries? Some cosmologists have proposed that the laws of physics might bootstrap themselves into existence, that they are the only self-consistent set of rules that could give rise to a universe capable of containing them. The universe might exist because it's the only possible universe that could consistently exist, a cosmic bootstrap paradox at the grandest scale imaginable. Consciousness remains the deepest mystery of all. We still don't understand how subjective experience emerges from objective physical processes, how the inner light of awareness arises from the darkness of unconscious matter. Bootstrap paradoxes add another layer to this mystery. Could consciousness itself be a bootstrap paradox? Does awareness create itself through some kind of temporal loop we haven't yet recognized? Some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory or orchestrated objective reduction, hint at feedback loops and self-reference that might be temporal as well as spatial. The limits of knowledge itself come into sharp focus when we contemplate bootstrap paradoxes. Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed us that mathematics contains truths that cannot be proven within the system. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle revealed fundamental limits to what we can know about quantum systems. Bootstrap paradoxes might represent another kind of fundamental limit, phenomena that we can describe mathematically but never fully understand intuitively, realities that exist beyond the reach of human comprehension. There's something beautiful about these persistent mysteries. They remind us that science is not about achieving complete knowledge, but about pushing the boundaries of ignorance ever outward. Each answer we find reveals new questions. Each solution opens new mysteries. The bootstrap paradox stands as a monument to the inexhaustible strangeness of reality, a reminder that no matter how much we learn, the universe will always have surprises in store. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not that bootstrap paradoxes might exist, but that we evolved in such a universe with minds capable of contemplating them, as if the cosmos bootstrapped into existence conscious beings capable of discovering their own impossible origin. And now, as our journey through the bootstrap paradox draws to its close, or perhaps to its beginning, for in the realm of circular time, every ending is also a commencement, we arrive at a place of profound contemplation and unexpected peace. There is something deeply calming about accepting that the universe contains mysteries that may never fully yield to human understanding. That reality is far stranger and more beautiful than our everyday experience suggests. Tonight, in these final moments of our exploration, we find not frustration in the face of paradox, but a kind of cosmic comfort in the eternal loops that might weave through the fabric of existence itself. Consider how the bootstrap paradox connects us to the deepest rhythms of the cosmos. We are beings made of atoms, forged in the hearts of dying stars, elements that have circulated through countless cycles of stellar birth and death. The carbon in our cells, the iron in our blood, the calcium in our bones, all have traveled through loops of creation and destruction that span billions of years. We are, in a very real sense, already part of cosmic bootstrap paradoxes, patterns that emerge from and return to the stellar cycles that have no ultimate beginning or end. There is profound beauty in imagining that some things in our universe might exist simply because they must, because they are the only patterns that can maintain themselves in the grand equation of existence. Like a perfect musical chord that resonates with itself, creating harmonics that reinforce the original tone, bootstrap paradoxes might be nodes of self-consistency in the vast symphony of space-time. They remind us that not everything needs a creator, an origin story, a first cause. Some truths might be eternal, self-supporting, existing in loops that have always been turning. The human heart has always known something about circular time that the mind struggles to grasp. We live our lives in cycles, the rhythm of heartbeat and breath, the turning of days into nights into days, the seasons that wheel through their eternal return. We tell ourselves stories that end where they began. We fall in love with songs that repeat their choruses. We find comfort in rituals that connect us to countless generations who performed the same acts in the same ways. Perhaps bootstrap paradoxes speak to something deep in our nature, a recognition that linear time is not the only truth, that some aspects of existence are better understood as circles than arrows. In contemplating these paradoxes, we join a conversation that stretches across centuries and cultures, from ancient philosophers who pondered eternal recurrence to modern physicists calculating the geometry of closed time-like curves. Humans have always sensed that time might hold secrets beyond our ordinary perception. We are part of an intellectual bootstrap paradox ourselves, each generation learning from the past and teaching the future, creating a loop of knowledge that has no clear beginning, no identifiable first teacher or student. The acceptance of mystery is not a defeat, but a form of wisdom, just as we can appreciate a piece of music without understanding the physics of sound waves, just as we can love without comprehending the neurochemistry of attachment. We can find peace in a universe that contains bootstrap paradoxes without fully understanding how they work. There is a kind of spiritual maturity in acknowledging that reality exceeds our grasp, that existence is larger than our theories about it. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider that you might be part of bootstrap paradoxes you'll never know about. Perhaps the kindness you showed to a stranger today will ripple through time in ways that eventually circle back to create the conditions for that very act of kindness. Perhaps the dreams you dream tonight contain information from futures that those dreams help create. Perhaps consciousness itself is a bootstrap paradox, awareness creating itself through its own recognition, thought thinking itself into existence. In the end, the bootstrap paradox teaches us humility and wonder in equal measure. Humility in recognizing the limits of our understanding, the boundaries of what minds evolved for survival on the African savanna can comprehend about the deep structure of reality, wonder at the sheer strangeness and beauty of a universe that permits such paradoxes, that weaves causality into loops and knots and patterns we're only beginning to glimpse. We are temporary patterns in the eternal dance of matter and energy, brief notes in a cosmic song that might have no beginning and no end, only endless variations on themes that play themselves. There is something profoundly consoling about the possibility that not everything needs explanation, that some mysteries are not problems to be solved, but features of reality to be appreciated. The bootstrap paradox invites us to relax our desperate grip on linear causation, to accept that the universe might be fundamentally stranger than we imagine, and to find in that strangeness not anxiety, but awe. We are children of a cosmos that transcends our understanding, participants in processes that loop through dimensions we cannot perceive, dancers in a ballet where some steps create their own choreography. And so, as consciousness begins to dissolve into the timeless realm of sleep, we leave you with this thought. Perhaps understanding everything is less important than appreciating the magnificent mystery of existing in a universe where effects can create their causes, where information can teach itself, where time might be a circle wearing the disguise of a line. In accepting the Bootstrap Paradox, we accept that reality is larger than logic, that existence exceeds explanation, and that sometimes the most profound truth is the one that remains forever just beyond the reach of understanding, calling to us across the impossible loops of time, inviting us to wonder, to imagine, and to find peace in the beautiful impossibility of it all. Sweet dreams in this cosmos of eternal cycles, where every ending is a beginning and every beginning remembers its end.